Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we have a returning guest on the show, Jason Maier. Jason's been on our show a bunch, as you all will know. He's the author of A Progressive's Case for Bitcoin, which you can find in the show notes if you haven't gotten that copy, or send it to a loved one or friend that you want to read and learn more about Bitcoin. He's a regular on our show, and we had a lot to talk about in this episode. About a lot going on in Bitcoin. We've had the Trump campaign talking about Bitcoin, businesses and Bitcoin miners meeting with Trump. We've had folks asking where are Democrats at in terms of a Bitcoin strategy and a Bitcoin message, and our message to progressives and Democratic voters and just individual people that we're trying to reach about Bitcoin and what this all means for them. And just talked about a lot of those things in this conversation and got a lot of nuance and really wise explanations from Jason on all of this, which is why I wanted him to come on the show and talk about all of these things. So thanks as always, Jason, for coming on the show. And I hope you all enjoyed this episode and share it far and wide. As usual, like and subscribe or wherever you get your podcasts, wherever you're listening, and on YouTube as well. And thanks for listening and joining us. And I will add, this is our first episode that is featuring bonus content. So an extended interview that I had with Jason. So if you're listening to this and you want to hear that extended interview, you can subscribe and become a paid supporter of our Substack to get bonus content like what I just mentioned, early release, a free TPB t-shirt, which if you're seeing on YouTube, you can actually see me wearing right now. This t-shirt, will send you one of those for free, and a host of other things that we'll be rolling out as well if you all are interested. So you can subscribe at our Substack. It's progressivebitcoiner.substack.com/subscribe. And it's also going to be in the show notes, and we post about it on social media as well. So again, that's progressivebitcoiner.substack.com/subscribe. And as always, check out our partner links. You can get $50 off miners, 100% renewable Bitcoin mining through SAS mining. So take advantage of that. You can find that link in the show notes. And then Bitbox, our sponsor for this episode. You can get 5% off Bitbox products, and the best way to safely and securely hold your Bitcoin private keys in cold storage. You got to get Bitbox. So you can get 5% off there. Head to bitbox.swish/TPB and use promo code TPB in checkout. That is bitbox.swish/TPB and TPB in checkout. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'll let you get to this conversation now, and we will see you again next week. Jason, welcome back to the Progressive Bitcoiner. How are you?
Great. Thank you, Trey. Excited to be here.
Yeah, always happy to have you on. A lot to talk about in this episode. For folks listening, we're probably about a week and a half behind what you were currently listening to in terms of the time. But there's been a lot going on in Bitcoin news with Bitcoin campaigning from the Trump campaign, with so many different things that we want to get into and talk about and just get your feelings and perspective on, Jason. And for a lot of progressives in the space, in the Bitcoin space, looking and trying to think of what all this means. So yeah, I think there's a lot to get into. But first off, how are you doing? How are things going?
Doing great. Yeah, no, life is good. We're sliding into the summer right now. And, my family's going to be moving in a month. So that's always kind of a stressor, but I think we're taking it in stride. So I'm doing very well.
Awesome. That's good to hear. Well, I'm going to jump in and get the elephant in the room out of the way. Donald Trump has been on the campaign trail, appealing to Bitcoiners quite a bit, to Bitcoin businesses and companies and miners, and a lot of other stuff that may continue to happen after we're recording this episode, which we'll keep people in tune with. And there are a lot of different opinions and feelings on this from a lot of different camps, from Bitcoiners in particular, some group of Bitcoiners, maybe even potentially folks that typically were Democrat progressive, potentially viewing this as, well, if it gets us closer to a Bitcoin adoption globally, then that's a good thing. And, we'll bite the bullet on this one. Others saying this is the worst thing imaginable. A lot of people somewhere in between in terms of this. So just wanted to see your take on this. I've got some follow-up questions in terms of what this actually means compared to Bitcoin Twitter versus the real world, and how those are two very different things. But just wanted to get your pulse check on this, seeing these things come up recently.
So, yeah, I mean, if like on the day of recording, if you're paying attention, you'll see Donald Trump showing up a lot on Bitcoin Twitter. And as you said, what's happening in the Twitter sphere is not necessarily always mirroring accurately what's happening in real life. What we do know is that, Donald Trump took some photos with some people who donated him some money, right? So like that was kind of a big like spike on Twitter, like, oh, look, there's these minors who met with Donald Trump and, they had a photo opportunity with him. But these are people who donated Donald Trump a lot of money, right? And so I feel like it's important to keep that context in perspective. And, really kind of just not following the clickbait or the headlines or Donald Trump thinks that, is the best person for Bitcoin or Donald Trump loves Bitcoin, but really actually start paying attention to what Donald Trump is saying and what he's doing, right? He's trying to get campaign contributions like any politician. He's obviously trying to get people to vote for him like any politician. And I have not yet seen any messaging from Donald Trump that would indicate that he is sincere about like his support for Bitcoin or that he even understands it. Today, there was this tweet that I don't even know if it's a real tweet, but this message from him that he wants all of the remaining Bitcoin to be made in the United States, right? So what you have almost immediately is just this sort of pandering nonsense that doesn't actually fit with like what's good for Bitcoin, right? And I'm okay with that, like on that level, because I don't, as many of your viewers and listeners know, like it's not as if I have any faith in Donald Trump to do the right thing. So he can say what he wants or do what he wants or collect money from whomever he would like. But the real problem is that, at least on Bitcoin Twitter, people are sort of falling for it. When you say things like, I want all of the remaining Bitcoin to be made in the United States, it just really betrays a complete lack of understanding about what Bitcoin is and why it is important. So I think that there's a lot of, it is fraught to put our faith in a politician. It is doubly fraught to put our faith in a politician like Donald Trump. And it seems as though the people who are really cheerleading behind this or getting excited about it are taking a really myopic view and not understanding sort of what are the long-term consequences of this? What are like second order effects? Are they thinking more than one move ahead? Because it can be damaging to the image of Bitcoin or Bitcoin adoption in the long term. And I feel like that's mostly what I'm upset about, is that Bitcoiners have all of a sudden lost their skepticism, their sort of radar for scammers. All of these things have just gone by the wayside because there's an opportunity that like one particular person is now saying that he likes Bitcoin. It makes me feel like, well, these are people who really just like Donald Trump and see it as an opportunity to like pump their bags a little bit, because if Donald Trump gets to be president and he says he likes Bitcoin, then Bitcoin's going to go up, and it's really short-term thinking. So I think that, I don't really get too upset about Donald Trump himself, but I think that I would expect more, at least from the general Bitcoin audience, to say, I think we should probably be breaking this apart a little bit. What does he know? What does he think? What does he understand about Bitcoin? And is it really a genuine desire to help the community or to understand why Bitcoin is useful? And so far, it hasn't really risen to that level for me. It just seems like sort of an opportunistic stance by Trump. And I would just expect more from the Bitcoin community in general. Obviously, there's plenty of people speaking out and making similar points to what I just made too. So.
Yeah, from a lot of different backgrounds, I'd say. You've got anarchists, you've got libertarians, you've got progressives and Democrats, and never Trump conservatives,
right? Yeah. Principled conservatives who know better. So yeah, there's a wide coalition of people who are skeptical of Donald Trump for good reason, and it just seems like I would expect like a typical Bitcoiner to be skeptical also. So yeah,
and I will. Obviously, people know and can assume where I stand on this as well. And, we're creating content, and our audience and what we hope to continue being our audience are progressives and the left. And there are a lot of people that align with those values worldwide. We've got quite a few listeners in Europe that are right there with us from day one that aren't involved with progressive politics. But this year, in every election, they say is the most critical of all time, right? But this year, in an election year, I do want to spend a lot of time talking about these political games, talking about politics and elections, and talking about the unfortunate reality in a lot of ways of what Alex Gladstein spends a lot of time focusing on, where we are the world's reserve currency. What the US does really matters. The decisions the executive makes and legislation makes about Bitcoin and privacy this or Elizabeth Warren saying that, those things have ramifications around the world. So I don't take that lightly in terms of these conversations. So it's not that I love that setup, but it is important to talk about. And so this year we're going to do some more episodes focused on politics and focused on these campaigns and things a little bit more than maybe we even typically would. I think we try to balance, and we're still doing human rights stuff, environmental stuff, very much so, our bread and butter. But I'm talking about politics this year, probably a little bit more than even I would want to. But I feel it's important for our audience and for the types of conversations. But I want to play devil's advocate a little bit. And as I've said on this show quite a bit, the Biden administration and many Democrats have not been warm and fuzzy to Bitcoin as an industry, as a means of payment, as freedom money, as we talk about it, saying it's for criminals and terrorists. And some people very, very vocal about that. And Bitcoin mining in general, wanting to impose some pretty extreme taxes on the mining industry for an industry that's the most renewable industry on the planet, bringing a lot of jobs, doing a lot of good things, and would like to be given more support to do even greater things, or not be so cast aside or legislated against unfairly. So I know a lot of people in the Bitcoin mining industry. And again, for a lot of listeners, right? A lot of these are public companies. These are very wealthy people that would benefit from tax breaks from Donald Trump. There's all of these things that I think, to your point, Jason, people should admit in the first place. Like there's all sorts of things that they hope that will benefit them as wealthy individuals. But I'm talking about Bitcoin mining in general, and some people in the mining industry that are very, what I think are good and ethical and moral people, saying they've been really frustrated and just feeling really down about how the Biden administration has approached the industry. So what would you say in light of that, in terms of some of those people saying we'd rather roll the dice with Trump because at least he's not openly daily attacking our industry? We'll roll the dice there, because that's what I've heard a lot, and I can understand that sentiment.
Yeah, and I can too. I feel like it doesn't feel good to sort of have an administration that doesn't really understand Bitcoin in the way that we would hope that they do, and certainly the idea about taxing or mining or energy use in that way, or putting limitations on Bitcoin self custody and all of those things, those are really serious considerations and things that we should be speaking to our elected representatives about, for sure. I don't. I think my stance is simply I do consider Bitcoin as an anti-fragile system that can withstand attacks and withstand sort of politicians who are negative towards it. And in fact, it has for many years. And so if you agree with that and you say, okay, yeah, I understand, like, the Bitcoin network and the community around Bitcoin is anti-fragile, and it can survive and it can do things despite not having the support of politicians, then I think that if you choose to vote, then you should be voting for who you would vote for regardless. Like, if Bitcoin wasn't a variable to you, who would you vote for anyway? If you don't think that, and you think that Bitcoin needs the help of a politician, then you need to choose, which politician do you think is going to help Bitcoin? And even then, I don't think I would come to the same conclusion that some of our, other Bitcoiner friends have come to. But I feel like it is a difficult thing, because what we're dealing with here is really like a Bitcoiner's stance on low time preference. Do you take the solution that is presenting itself right now? So you can say, oh, that person is saying they're not going to fight against Bitcoin, and I'm going to just latch onto that solution and go with it in the immediate short term, and sort of forsake a long-term improvement to the network or adoption or building a robust coalition of supporters across political aisles. And I feel like Bitcoiners should have more of a low time preference and say, this the solution that's presenting itself as pretty much opposition to Joe Biden and saying, well, look, I'm going to do good things for Bitcoin mining, or I'm going to do good things for Bitcoin if I'm president, that's a that's a high time preference move. Like, what we need to do is maybe pump the brakes a little bit and realize that, having a politician that is against Bitcoin is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. We've had that for the last 15 years. How can instead I pump the brakes a little bit and start to build up that diverse coalition of supporters and people who are actually understand Bitcoin? And maybe in 2028, when Joe Biden and Donald Trump are both probably dead, like, we'll elect somebody who understands Bitcoin. That would be the ideal. So I get it. I understand that it's scary to have somebody say, "Oh, I'm going to tax Bitcoin mining, electricity use or something like that." It's not fair, and it probably wouldn't stand up in court or whatever. Like, I get it, but like, Bitcoiners and Bitcoin itself has withstood far graver threats than that, and latching on to somebody who is telling you what you want to hear is not a low time preference move.
Yeah, I think that's a really great response. And I think that's where I fall to as well. And I've been saying this more and more to people. There's something about Bitcoin surviving and thriving in adversarial environments. And what I mean by adversarial, right? Like, as of today in this recording, and my belief, and I'm glad to be proven wrong at some point, I can still self-custody Bitcoin. I can still buy Bitcoin. There are many different ways I can do that. I self-custody with Bitbox, but people can do it through so many other sources. All these multi-sig institutions. There's so many ways to use, spend, hold, save in Bitcoin today. In ways that I view existential threats would have to be constitutional threats that would mean other things are under threat. So I've seen some people talking about, Trump saying, okay, we're going to keep Elizabeth Warren away from your Bitcoin. And I want to be mindful. I feel like there's multiple different levels here. There's Bitcoin companies, there's rich individuals that could benefit with stock prices in these fiat games. And there's just holding and using Bitcoin. And there are ways that, like right now, right, it is more difficult to spend Bitcoin in the US because those are taxable transactions. Would Donald Trump change that? Not that I know of at this point. There's some legislators that I think would be open to that, but Donald Trump isn't going to risk the reserve status of the US dollar, as far as I understand, with payments. And he's been pretty bold on that. I'm not sure any US president would be going out and saying that right now from any type of party. So for me, I go back to your point on who would you vote for outside of Bitcoin. As a progressive, and most progressives I know that are listening and supporters of us have a lot of other values that we deeply care about. I am deeply opposed to Donald Trump positioning people in Supreme Court that overturn Roe v. Wade and now make it very difficult for women to get healthcare, contraception, in some cases potentially, and abortion access. That's deeply troubling to me. Different stances on immigration. There's a lot of things that I care about and view as more important than the price of Bitcoin or the stock price of a particular Bitcoin mining company. And that's just, for me, a value set that would lead me to not vote for this person, regardless of political party, about the individual that is Donald Trump.
And not least among them is a commitment to a peaceful transition of power, which I think is like critical to sort of a thriving democracy, which I don't think that we have that commitment from Donald Trump, and we haven't from 2016 when he was in debates with Hillary Clinton. He was not committed to a peaceful transition of power. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I feel like it is short-sighted. It's high time preference to say, oh, he's saying he likes Bitcoin, and Bitcoiners seem to be trusting that, not verifying it, right? Like, I think my 9-year-old could do better on a 20-question Bitcoin quiz than Donald Trump could. Like, I don't think that Donald Trump really understands how Bitcoin operates. He's just saying the things that he's been whispered to, and he's saying them incorrectly. But there's a lot of downsides to Donald Trump. At least like me and you probably see that, and a lot of the listeners do too. But I think there's just too many. I shouldn't say too many, but there seems to be a lot of people in the Bitcoin space who don't view those negatives as negatives, and they're going to vote for Donald Trump anyway. And it's just sort of a nice reinforcing moment for them to say, oh, yeah, look, and he also likes Bitcoin, And there's all of these other things that he's doing that I like too. And you and I and plenty of other people don't like that. Those other sort of issues that are important that are not Bitcoin related necessarily. So given the choice between that and realizing that Bitcoin has to thrive for another 4 years in a somewhat adversarial environment, I'm going to put my chips on Bitcoin. I feel like it's going to be just fine, and doesn't need my vote to help it, and it doesn't need a president of the United States to help it, at least not now. And there isn't, in 2024, I'm willing to say that there is no president who could enact and would be politically motivated to enact genuinely pro Bitcoin policies, right? Like the dollar holds a place in the world economy that is frankly too important for a president to be sort of willy-nilly about it. And I don't think even Donald Trump would be willing to back Bitcoin the way that like some of these Bitcoiners would like him to. That's more like a 2032, a 2048, 2050 kind of move or something like that, not a 2024 move. And I feel like, it's better to be patient and understand that we need both voters and politicians to start understanding the benefit of Bitcoin and how it works and why it's important before we just latch on to some blind support, because there are downsides. There's downsides and risks to electing Donald Trump. Even if he does come through in some minor ways with Bitcoin, it's not as if that on net it's going to be positive for the country, I don't think.
Yeah, I'm a bit flabbergasted by the lack of pause for reputational risk. Some major Bitcoin businesses, not individuals, but on behalf of their businesses and business events, saying when he is elected president. And I understand the Biden admin has not been possibly even talking to these businesses or engaging in this way, but there's a very good chance in the real world Donald Trump is still incredibly unpopular with a lot of people. It's still, to me, it's a bit harder for him to get elected. It is not a shoo-in as folks on Bitcoin Twitter think in the real world. It could be close. It could be a close election. I think the recent polls, as of recording, they could change, has Joe Biden up a little bit. The felony charge definitely didn't help Trump there. So it's not a shoo-in for these people to be latching themselves onto the leaky lifeboat that is Donald Trump. So that's been an interesting thing for me to observe. And a lot of Bitcoin businesses have been staying out of it and trying to build broad coalitions, as I think is a very smart move. But I keep wanting to echo, like, I can understand, because I think people think we can be a bit naive, but I think the more vocal progressive Bitcoiners have been very, very open and quite not naive in terms of we understand our thinking around all of these issues. And maybe at the end of the day, where I fall is like, my values just do not align with that person, and if yours do, okay, agree to disagree. That is separate from a Bitcoin conversation for me.
And I think that's part of the conversation. I think that what I see happening, and especially this week in particular, and you can Donald Trump fits into this umbrella, under this umbrella, and so does Tucker Carlson fits under this umbrella, is that Bitcoiners and Bitcoin companies, plural, are not thinking more than one move ahead. I mean, it's seriously, it is, in computer science, what we call the greedy algorithm. Like, where I'm sitting right now, what's the most optimal move that I can make if I'm thinking one move ahead? And, supporting Donald Trump for presidency is like almost the epitome of, I'm thinking one move ahead. How can I pump my bags? How can I get this guy who says he likes Bitcoin into office, and not thinking about what you described as the reputational risk, right? There's no way in which having Donald Trump being a vocal proponent of Bitcoin is like overall good in the long run. I just don't see it. I don't think if you're thinking more than one move ahead, I think that's a detriment to Bitcoin adoption, Bitcoin understanding, and the dialogue around it. It's just too polarizing. And and on top of that, you add the fact that I don't really think he understands it, and I really don't think he's going to support it once he's in office, and all of those things. Those are different kinds of risks, right? Where he's just going to rug pull his supporters who think that he's going to do all these amazing things for Bitcoin. That's one risk, but this reputational risk and like sort of deterioration of the dialogue. I just feel like these people are not thinking more than one move ahead. It's just the greedy algorithm. What can I do right now that maximizes, like, it's locally optimal but not globally optimal? And I feel like Bitcoiners are all about low time preference. Like, how do we see success far into the future? And it's not just how do I get like a green God candle because Donald Trump won election, and then it's just going to crash down and it's going to be a divisive political issue. So
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the Bitbox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank Bitbox for their support of the podcast. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. But what I was visualizing when you were talking about that low time preference and just, it's almost like you're going fishing, right? And you know you're going to catch the fish. They're there. You just got to be patient. It's been happening year after year, like slowly Bitcoin gobbling up the world and gaining more supporters and gaining a little bit more bipartisan support as well, and kind of a slower understanding from some of the younger Democrats and kind of these different voters that are moving past that. Greenpeace's arguments are kind of falling apart. We're getting better environmental narratives, all of this stuff, right? And Bitcoin is only 15 years old and arguably only 4 or 5 years old in a mainstream conscience. So I've seen so much change, and I've only been in Bitcoin 3 years now, and I've seen radical changes in stuff. By the time we're talking, like, Resistance Money is out, this academic book now with an academic publisher by philosophy professors.
yes,
That'll be utilized as a
excellent book,
source.
by the way. Highly recommend.
Yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Right.
So for me, it's like, would you rather go fishing and do that, or would you rather throw a grenade into the lake, blow up all these fish, damage the lake, drain the lake, all of these other consequences? Just be patient, even though these folks are saying they want Bitcoin adoption spread around the world. It's already happening. So it's just a lot of hypocrisy, to say it a bit more extremely, that I'm seeing. And I'm not going to be right about 100% of things, but some people are saying this very confidently, like, we have to elect Donald Trump. And I just don't buy that. I don't buy that. I'm not here for that.
Right. And, like I say, it's as if we've stripped away from Bitcoiners all of the things that are sort of valuable within the Bitcoin ethos, right? Like, don't trust, verify. Like, people are not verifying Donald Trump's, bona fides on Bitcoin right now. The long time preference thing, being skeptical of politicians, like calling out scammers. Like, if you consider yourself a Bitcoiner and you're like, hey, that's a scam, like, this crypto nonsense is a scam, and you're really proud of calling out scammers, like, where are you on Donald Trump? How can you not be calling out, like, probably the most scammiest person in the world? So, like, all of these attributes that Bitcoiners give themselves to say, hey, we're like, this is sort of how we think about the world, and it's good for society to think about the world this way, is just sort of, they're jettisoning it because this guy has said, oh, I like Bitcoin. So I just feel like there's, hypocrisy is one way for it. Just like lack of principles is another one. I feel like that's a different way to describe the same thing. So yeah, ultimately I think Bitcoin, as you say, is going to do just fine. The adoption will keep going, and the understanding will keep going, and the politicians will slowly come aboard as the voters do. And this path that some of our friends want to take us down is not like a recipe for long-term success.
Yeah, I view it also in reading. We were talking about Resistance Money, the book, reading about ethics and morality, thinking about Bitcoin, not about you can argue like Bitcoin is ethical and moral in this way, but what does Bitcoin enable that are ethical and moral actions is also the way I think about it, in terms of, like, we talk nonstop, and I got into this because I seeing human rights angles, and because seeing the tools of liberation for marginalized communities that's in in Bitcoin. And I thought that was really cool. Like we don't have to rely on Wall Street to have some sort of retirement, all of these other things. So thinking about your own ethics and morality, and it's really tricky when money and greed comes into it. And that's what's tricky about Bitcoin. It's this really cool tool that can be used in extremely ethical and moral ways, but it's also tied to a gain of purchasing power. So people are constantly balancing between the two that everyone, including you and I, have to check ourselves on, of not in terms of voting for Donald Trump or not, but just in terms of like, ooh, the price went up today. And then you notice the endorphins, you notice, okay, like obviously we want the price to go up. Obviously, I would like to save more for my family as a millennial, all of these things. And that's a huge part of it, but not losing sight of the global phenomenon. And I think just reading a book like Resistance Money, reading Alex Gladstein's books, reading Broken Money by Lynn Alden, all of these have this global massive theme that allow you to take a step back and realize that we don't need XYZ politician. The bigger picture implication of this, when I talk to human rights activists about someone like Donald Trump, right? The kind of like spine tingle they get knowing this person has endorsed straight up authoritarians and endorsed murdering drug traffickers and things like this that may or may not have due process. A lot of things that send tingles up their spine. And again, people will be like, what about Biden and this and that, authoritarian? Yes, sure, we can break that down. That's just not what we're talking about right now. And we've been very critical on this podcast of all people on folks from the left. And we'll continue to do so because we believe in supporting the people and holding people in positions of authority, holding their feet to the flame, so to speak. So people just need to take a step back. I want to echo your point on low time preference and not be so reactionary. That's 100% right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, moving on from this a little bit, because as I was telling you before the recording, we're not going to spend the next several weeks just talking about how terrible Trump is and how terrible this is for Bitcoin and all this stuff. Still, the overarching theme is we want to talk about the global stories of empowerment with Bitcoin, with mining, with human rights activists, and also talk about how when any progressives or Democrats might see stuff about Donald Trump supporting Bitcoin, remind them you can buy and use Bitcoin today. Bitcoin can be used for you, just like it can be used for a conservative or for a Trump supporter. Bitcoin is for anyone and everyone that wants to use it, and it's available to folks. So I wanted to pivot a bit and talk about, in terms of this Trump news, before we pivot to kind of a strategy for Democrats. Do you think that people are going to be distracted by this, right? I think we're a little early on right now, but do you think that this might turn into more of it's coming up in mainstream news articles and progressives are like, oh my gosh, that's MAGA money, these kind of worst case scenarios of what they interpret it as, or is this kind of a nothing burger? And a lot of people from all walks of life hold Bitcoin today, hold crypto, and they're just not involved with the Twitter dialogue. They're not involved with the politics of it. And they're just like, yeah, I get it. Or they might think of Bitcoin as a scam, but they're not tying it to a particular political view, right? There's all sorts of different, that's another, talking point. But I'm just curious, do you think this is something that's interesting for us to talk about as Bitcoiners involved with Bitcoin community? Or do you think this could translate to, wow, this is going to make our job a lot harder, or your job a lot harder, talking about your book and talking about people in your community are progressives about Bitcoin? Where do you think about that right now?
I think it could go one of two ways. Either people, sort of like normal everyday people who are not plugged into Bitcoin or crypto, don't really pay attention to this at all. And it doesn't, like you said, it's a nothing burger. It doesn't really affect anybody. That could happen. But I do think that there are plenty of people out there who haven't really gotten on board the Bitcoin train, right? Most people. And I feel like to what you just said, Donald Trump being sort of a prominent supporter of Bitcoin. And by the way, it's not Bitcoin, it's crypto, right? And I think that we should maybe talk a little bit about that. But these people are already skeptical of Bitcoin / crypto, as they should be, And I say this to people all the time, right? Like when you're talking about the internet combined with money, you should be skeptical. It's just what was already maybe a non-starter for a lot of people will just be more so a non-starter. It's just like there's no foothold to actually have a conversation with somebody if they're plugged into the fact that Donald Trump is a big proponent of cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. It's just going to be sort of they're going to wash their hands from it. So that's my fear. I think it does make my job harder, right? As somebody who wrote like a progressives case for Bitcoin, to have a conversation with somebody and convince them that it actually does bring good to the world and that you should be somebody who wants to learn about Bitcoin and support it. And so I think it just makes my job harder. It makes it easier for that person who I'm trying to orange pill to just sort of dismiss it out of hand. Right. And I feel like there's no sort of way that I can enter into that conversation in a way that will make them hear me. So that's my fear. And I think that's probably just based on sort of my experience in the space and talking to normies and talking to pre-coiners. I think that's probably a likely thing to happen. And sort of separate from that, and I brought this up a second ago, like the idea between like, is Donald Trump supporting Bitcoin or is he supporting crypto? And I feel like this is part of like the go slow, low time preference, like build a coalition kind of thing, educate people over time, because right now there is no political incentive to really be Bitcoin only. Like there's plenty of incentive right now because there's a nice chunk of people who are into crypto to support cryptocurrencies. So if you're just looking from like a strict, like where do I find votes and where can I get support from and who can I get money, rolling into my campaign, it's very hard to make a case that like Bitcoin only is going to win out of that. It's going to be cryptocurrencies. And of course, we know that a year from now, 6 months from now, 2 years from now, there's going to be more scams. There's going to be more rug pulls. There's going to be more exchange hacks, all of those things that are associated with crypto that normies are going to lay on top of Bitcoin that really aren't about Bitcoin. All of that's still going to happen. So for me, like regardless of Donald Trump, Joe Biden, any politician out there, like if I had a choice, I would rather have a Bitcoin only political candidate in 8 years than a Bitcoin / crypto candidate now. It's not going to help like the long-term goals that I have, which is to like help Bitcoin envision like this bright orange future that we hope for. It's just going to be a setback because it's going to further link crypto with Bitcoin. All of the scams that happen with crypto are going to be laid at Bitcoin's feet, and it's just going to make things more messy. So I feel like that's another sort of aspect of all of this that we didn't really talk about before, which is like, are you getting a Bitcoin president? Are you getting a crypto president? Or are you getting neither? And I feel like a lot of very thoughtful people kind of realize that you're either getting neither, like it's just a total rug pull, we're just going to take your money for the campaign and then not do anything for you. Or maybe in the best case scenario, you might be getting a crypto president, which then muddies the waters further. So all of that, to your original question, makes my job harder, right? Like I have a hard time talking to people about Bitcoin because they assume it's a right-wing thing. That's going to get harder if Donald Trump is elected or is a proponent of Bitcoin. And I also have a hard time convincing people that they should be considering Bitcoin as a separate entity than crypto. And that's going to get harder too.
Yet I think we are I've said this in our Telegram group. For folks that don't know, you can join us in our Telegram group. We chat all things like this in the group. There's like 188 some odd number with a variety of political views, but a lot progressive leaning that want to have these conversations. That's in the show notes. But I think one of the things that's tough is we are unicorns, that we are progressive left-leaning folks, but also Bitcoin only, because there is quite a bit of really diverse left-leaning gay, Black, marginalized communities, global, like very, very diverse ranging or very left-leaning groups in crypto and different crypto projects that do not view Bitcoin as their home. And again, some people might say, well, that's just silly. They shouldn't get tied up into community stuff. Just buy and hold Bitcoin, use it. Just ignore the other stuff. Well, for some people, that's quite difficult. It can be challenging just for you and I sometimes, but it doesn't waver our views of Bitcoin and using Bitcoin. But it sometimes causes me to be like, do I want to do the, like, especially in the US, where politicize everything and right left everything, and it's very very overwhelming. The toxic maxi US libertarian stuff, that's overwhelming. So there are a lot of liberals and folks that are into crypto or into Ethereum. Like what has that challenge been like for you? Because I've had conversations with people a lot where that comes up, or yeah, Bitcoin is outdated, or Bitcoin is that, right wing libertarian money, and this is better for X, Y, and Z, right? And then you go back into just kind of principles of the different things. But there's quite a robust liberal community that a lot of Bitcoiners will say, well, yeah, if you're liberal, then go for Ethereum. That's better for you anyway.
Right.
And I'm like, that's not helpful. Or
Right,
like,
right.
what did I see recently? That Bitcoin is for meat eaters and Ethereum is for vegans. And I'm like, you guys aren't helping. Like you're not
Right.
helping with this. And I'm saying this because a lot of people know this already, right? I'm not trying to instill this belief in folks. It's just kind of there. So I'm just pointing it out. But for me, that's a whole other thing, is the crypto with Democrat leaning voters in the US, or liberals, is very strong. And it's even hard to talk to them about Bitcoin for that reason.
Yeah, and again, like you and I probably often find ourselves, I know I do, sort of in between two battles, like fronts, right? Like I'm fighting a battle on the right and on the left, and I'm fighting against Bitcoiners who are conservative or libertarian. Yeah, fighting is a strong word, but like I'm having to field critiques from. In addition to that, people who are into cryptocurrencies and view me as sort of a sellout because I'm into Bitcoin and not crypto. And then sort of like no coiners and pre-coiners who are not into Bitcoin yet, or probably never will be because they've made up their mind and want to fight me about that too, right? So it's a challenge. And I feel like, again, like it goes back to like, what are the incentives? Right now, the incentives are not for politicians to be Bitcoin only in the United States. They are, and you can hear the way that the politicians talk about it. Like very few politicians are coming out as crypto only or Bitcoin only, right? Like Cynthia Lummis and Kristen Gillibrand and Ted Cruz aren't. They're saying the word crypto also, right? Like it's not as if we have a Bitcoin only senator or president or something like that. So it just. So the incentives aren't there yet. So what do? Well, pump the brakes and start to educate people. And what we do know is that like over time, there are many people who are into crypto become gradually through education and bad experiences become Bitcoin only, right? Well, allow that to happen a little bit more, right? Allow the sort of the political force of the voting bloc to get to be more Bitcoin only. And that will happen over time before we go all in on a presidential candidate has a lot of other baggage, because you're not getting a Bitcoin only president. And if does it really help Bitcoin in the medium to long term if you have a crypto president? I don't think so personally. I don't. But obviously a lot of people out there have different opinions about it, but that's my take.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun, robust debate that will happen. What I do love about this space and people that are able to do stuff even more full time than me or you pretty soon going back to teaching is you'll see one article that pops up about Donald Trump is the best thing for Bitcoin. Then 2 days later, Donald Trump's the worst thing for Bitcoin. Like there's a lot of yin and yang in the space. There could always be more. There's a lot of rich, robust debate, this conversation being one of them, to just add into the mix of so many different opinions. The one thing that is true is that Bitcoin is this open source protocol. And from there, you could talk about what is Bitcoin. For a lot of us, Bitcoin is better money, is freedom money, is enabling a lot of these other things. There's so many rich debates about it, but that's the starting point. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of different opinions on what do we do with that information? What do we do with this technology, this money? So that is the one very cool thing about this, is that we don't exactly know what these conversations might look like in 6 months.
I'll just point out, I'm inspired a little bit about sort of one of the theses in Resistance Money, which will be out and publicly available by the time this episode airs, is this idea of making your analysis of Bitcoin through like behind this veil of ignorance, right? Like if you and people have talked, the authors have talked about this too, right? If you were sort of going to be born as like a random person on the planet, would you rather live in a world with Bitcoin or without? And I feel like it's an interesting thought experiment to do that, but to say like, would you rather live in the United States, not knowing who's going to be elected president next, with Bitcoin or without Bitcoin, right? Like, do you want Bitcoin to exist in a world where Donald Trump is president? If you're like me and you, probably. Like, I feel like it's resistance money, and it allows me to do things, or allows marginalized communities to do things. And if you're on the other side of the political spectrum, you want Bitcoin to exist if, like, Joe Biden is president for the same reason. So I feel like that veil of ignorance kind of framework, and that thought experiment kind of works with like not knowing, because as you said before in this chat, like, it will probably be a close election, and I don't see a world in which the election is close and there's not some sort of constitutional crisis / violence. So like, we can kind of anticipate we're going to be living in a world where more than half of the country is going to be like upset, displaced, upset, like not knowing what to do. And like, do you want to live in a world where Bitcoin exists or doesn't exist in that situation? I think that's a really useful thought experiment also.
Yeah, and a very philosophical understanding. And the one thing that I really like that Brad said in our recent episode, which if people haven't listened, you can go back a couple episodes ago, you can go back and listen. He was talking about, if your causes or your existence, I forget the exact quote, or what you're doing depends on, or your money, all of these things depends on who is in power. That's not a very good system to anchor to, right? What's great about Bitcoin is it is resistance money, right? Like, there are different ways to build all these technologies, these privacy tools to use Bitcoin that doesn't matter who is in power, because it's not controlled by them in that regard. So that's one of the brilliant things. And that's one thing I say to progressives all the time. Brad and I said it in a lot of our episode, is like, right now, there's been a lot of wins for progressive in terms of you might feel safer and more comfortable in your worldview, your cause, because quote unquote, your team is in power. What happens when your team isn't in power? What happens is politicians will be like, well, that wasn't our fault. You guys elected Republicans. So there's that. With Bitcoin, you do have a fighting chance to still support the cause as an activist that you believe in, or receive and pay money, or flee countries for human rights activists that we have on, all of these horrible things that I hope do not happen, period, at all. Don't hear what I'm not saying. It's a backup plan, like plan B. With Bitcoin, it is resistance money. That is one of the greatest promises for progressives to think about.
And in my book, I describe that idea as January 5th thinking, right? Like, is say, okay, what's the world look like on January 5th versus January 6th, and to realize that, like, this veil of civilization and democracy is very thin, and so far we've been okay with it. But to imagine that you don't want Bitcoin in a world in which that veil starts to tear, and somebody else gets into power who you don't want to be in power, is pretty short-sighted. So for sure, I think that thinking about it in those ways is really important. And if you are comfortable because your team is in power right now, then you need to be thinking further into the future, because it won't always be. So.
Yeah, and one thing I think about a lot, and last time we talked, it was funny because it was shortly before the Bitcoin ETFs were launched. I believe it was maybe a few days or a week before. So we did some kind of projecting. We talked about campaign stuff a little bit, but obviously things ratcheted up quite a bit more. And one of the things I wanted to talk with you about, as we just talked about, it doesn't really to Bitcoin, it might not so matter as much, or be short-term thinking to think about who's in positions of power. It can matter on a lot of other fronts, especially. But the one thing I do care about is seeing a missed opportunity from Democrats when it comes to Bitcoin, whether it's campaign strategy, whether it's local office, state Senate, whatever, just encouraging folks to be a little bit more bold, to buck the trend of Elizabeth Warren and others that have some pretty tight restraints on rhetoric around this. And we're seeing that a little bit. But, if a lot of our listeners are supporters that I will say, please reach out to your local politicians, your especially if you're in Democratic districts, and let them know how you feel about Bitcoin, about how you feel about this technology, about the amazing stories we and so many others share about what it's doing. Let your voice be heard. Ask for meetings. Go to town halls. Like, those are very effective ways, especially if you live in those districts, right? Try to think in your districts. What would you say to certain staffers, certain Democratic voters that really just care about Bitcoin? Because one of the things I really think through, and I don't think it's going to happen right now, but over the long term, Democrats need to have a Bitcoin strategy. Like thinking about this, I'm also a little bit of a political nerd, like thinking about this. They're getting completely beat on Bitcoin strategy from the right. They are hijacking Bitcoin for their own purposes. We could talk about, reasons why, but Democrats are completely missing out on innovative technology, on jobs, on better savings for retirement, and all of these beautiful things that we don't have to talk about reserve currency status. We don't have to talk about overthrowing the US government. There's a lot of things right now that Bitcoin is doing that are really great for a lot of people. And more people are seeing that and waking up to that. Democrats need a Bitcoin strategy. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, first and foremost, right? Like to repeat what you just said is that if you, the most important thing you can do is sort of act locally, right? So reach out to your local politicians. Like it's not hard to find the contact information, fill out a form, and write up a paragraph or two to describe, like, hey, I am a constituent of yours, I support Bitcoin, and here are the reasons that I think it is important. Not just like a pump my own bags kind of thing, but like, here are the benefits that it has to the world and to our congressional district or to our state or whatever the case is. Do that and do it frequently. And even if you're not a progressive person, but you live in like a blue district, then you should do that too. Like, should still, like, if you're a Bitcoiner who's Republican or conservative, and you live in a blue congressional district, like, reach out to your representative. They're representing you too, and describe, like, hey, there's a book called The Progressive's Case for Bitcoin. You should learn a little bit more about how Bitcoin works and makes the world a better place and more fair and equitable for everybody on the planet. Engage your politicians and actually start to have those conversations, and you will be laughed at. Like, if you go to a town hall and you go to an open forum and you actually stand up and speak and say, like, I think that Bitcoin is humanity's best chance to make the world a more equitable and peaceful place, and here are the reasons I think that, people will chuckle and they'll laugh at you, but that's fine, just do it anyway. And the more times they hear it, the more they're going to realize that this is something that they can't ignore anymore. The caution that I have for people is to try your very best to differentiate Bitcoin from crypto. Like, I'm not interested in having more like pro crypto politicians in office. Like, I want people who are understanding the benefits of Bitcoin, and voting and crafting legislation and policy to that effect. Satoshi Action Fund is a really good model in terms of working with states and not like the federal government necessarily. So, like, the more local you can be, the better. And just sort of hone your own talking points in your conversations and realize that, like, you are in a minority right now and people won't understand it when you say it, but the more that the politicians hear it, the better it's going to be for like sort of the vision that we have to say, okay, this is going to now get sort of nonpartisan support, right? Not bipartisan, but nonpartisan support. It's going to be a support from everybody because it actually does do good in the world. And so make your voice heard, right? And not necessarily, we talked a lot about this. Like, I'm not proposing anybody become like a single issue voter. And in fact, like, most of the elections that matter in your local community, right? Like your town, your county, your state, your congressional district, like, you don't get to be a single issue voter on Bitcoin because it's not like one person supports Bitcoin and the other one doesn't. It's like kind of like it's not on anybody's radar, right? So get it on people's radar. It seems like, if you follow Bitcoin Twitter a lot, it just seems like all of these Republicans are supporting Bitcoin and the Democrats are so far behind. But it's really a blip if you think about like the 535 members of the Senate and the Congress. Like, it's not like it's everybody on the Republican side is in favor right now. We still have a lot of runway left. So just engage in that conversation. Look, you can Google it in 20 seconds. Here's all of the people that represent me based on my address, right? Like, on the local, state, and federal level, here are all of my representatives. And there will be links to submit forms and to give your feedback to those representatives. And then, like you said, go out when they're campaigning, go out to a a town hall or an open forum and actually have conversations with these people. Usually if you're doing it on a local level, like you can actually get some FaceTime and a microphone in front of you and say a thing if you're willing for the audience to kind of chuckle at you, but you're saying something important. So I feel like that's A1A is just engage with the local representatives, like your elected representatives, and let them know that this is an issue, and you're not going to educate them on the full scope of like the benefits of Bitcoin in a 15-second question, but you can let them know, like, yeah, wow, this is not the first time I've heard that. Okay, I need to start taking it more seriously, and go slow. Right, like I realize it's going to be a slower process than just going to the top, finding a presidential candidate that says what you want them to say, and then we've won. It's much more ground up than that has to be.
Yeah, I think to your point on, they keep hearing it come up more and more. And I think one of the strategies too that I try to think about is, from progressives and a lot of our audience, and a lot of Democrats in general, since 2016, where Trump won, and people are, how did that happen, right? With Hillary and with Bernie and all of these things, a lot of progressives, or whether it's been Joe Biden's response on Palestine or on affordability issues, or all of these different things that especially younger people, Gen Z, millennials, really care about, and these left-leaning voters, they feel a bit like, are you guys listening and paying attention to us? One of the things with Bitcoin is it's not just about Bitcoin. It's saying, hey, the world is moving. There's this thing that exists that seems pretty cool. You can talk about innovation. You can talk about we're falling behind other places. We are being outbeat by Republicans, which we hate and can't stand. Why are they talking about this and we aren't? Why are we letting them win on this issue? I think there's a lot of things to really get under the skin of these leaders and elected officials and say, wake up, you need to represent us. You are falling behind. Because a lot of people in the US, a lot of left and liberal voters are actually owners of Bitcoin and would be open to it. Maybe, again, it gets a little, maybe they own other crypto and this and that, but know of Bitcoin, and they'd rather someone allow that to flourish than be so against it and say these things where they're like, well, if they're so off about Bitcoin, what else could they be off about? And then it causes you to question other things, and just avoid all that and say, hey, be open and honest with us, and listen to us and carry this message forward. Or else, potentially worst case, you might lose some voters to Trump. Like, my personal opinion, I don't think we're at the stage where this is going to swing an entire election. I know some people have been saying that, but it's definitely not helping the Democrats' cause. That's for sure.
I agree. And if you want just like, all right, what are the 2 or 3 bullet points that like you're going to, if you get yourself in front of a Democratic congressperson, for example, right? Or like even your state senator, right? Like somebody local who actually operates, like it's going to be green energy, and it's going to be rural jobs, and it's going to be about financial inclusion, right? If you only had 3 things and you only had time to say 3 things, like those 3 things are going to get the attention of like a local politician, right? And even if they don't agree with you in the moment, or they give you sort of a political answer, or they lump Bitcoin in with crypto in that moment, that's fine. But just keep at it, like keep talking about those things, and realize like the financial innovation, or just innovation in general, and it's going someplace else. And all of the things that you just said, Trey, is like, we have an opportunity to speak to these people, and it's still really early. Like we're not, I don't personally feel like I'm in any rush, and I'm a lot older than you are. Like I don't have any rush that Bitcoin moons, and I'd rather have a more of a solid base and build up adoption and build up support and build up understanding over time than just have it go to 1 million as quickly as possible and have it be sort of on unsteady foundation. So just keep talking to your local politicians and the people who are meant to represent you. And again, like maybe the best tool that we might have are some of these more conservative or Republican people who happen to be in these blue districts, like doing the same thing and saying like, hey, I didn't vote for you, but I would like you to represent me in this way. And here are the ways that Bitcoin aligns with the values that you say that you have. So there's some interesting options there. Who knows?
One last question I'll leave you with. There's a lot we could talk about, but obviously, as I say every episode, there's so many resources that folks can just sit with this stuff more. Again, think low time preference. Like Pick up Resistance Money and read it. Pick up Jason's book, A Progressive's Case for Bitcoin, laying out all these great use cases for Bitcoin that might align with progressive values, which we can't recommend enough. Like, read this, share these books, share articles of human rights and environmental causes that are supportive in using Bitcoin. They're more frequent than ever and continuing to grow. So those resources are now there in ways they weren't a few years ago. So people need to sit with that. But I would say if you could also just say, folks stumble in to this episode and are thinking through, okay, well, what could Bitcoin do for a progressive or someone who really, really cares about financial inclusion, that cares about these human rights things, that cares about the environment, that cares about care for the community? Like, what can Bitcoin do for them? Because I've just seen Ted Cruz talk about it, or I've only seen, okay, BlackRock and Wall Street is involved. Like, that doesn't sound like my cup of tea. So what would you say to people that really have progressive values and say, what can Bitcoin do for me? What can Bitcoin do in these moments that are for things I really care about?
Yeah. I think that Bitcoin, first and foremost, understanding and learning about Bitcoin through the resources that you just mentioned and so many more nowadays, it's easier than ever. The first thing that it does is it helps you understand the current financial system better than most of the population. So learn about Bitcoin and understand how it is different from and situates itself differently than the current financial system that we have, which, if you're a progressive person in the United States right now, you probably think that the current system is unfair and opaque and takes advantage of people, and you're right. And then begin to understand how Bitcoin separates itself from that on a very conceptual level, that it is fair and transparent and open to everybody. Zoom out. So if you're a progressive in America, think about not just the fact that you happen to be born into a dollar system, which is very convenient and happens to be like winning the lottery, but most of the world doesn't have dollars. They were born into some other more fraudulent system that you stand to lose money through purchasing power through inflation, or having your bank account seized just because of a political stance, and all these things might be coming to America soon, but not yet. So zoom out, think about the people in the world who are not just sort of poor and living on $1 a day just by accident, but actually, like, it is the system that is designed to be that way. And think about how Bitcoin actually might be an open, fair, and transparent way for people all around the world to have access to a financial system that builds them up instead of tearing them down, and gives them opportunities instead of limiting them. And if you're a progressive in the US and you really care about the environment, then learning about Bitcoin will help you unlearn some of the things that you think you know about energy use and pollution and global warming. And all of those things are real and problems and need to be addressed. And it's not as if, Bitcoiners naturally are some like climate denying weirdos that are conspiracy theorists. Like, it's actually like the energy grid and how energy is produced, and like what are the limitations of renewable energy is really important to understand. And taking a more nuanced approach to understanding energy use, energy production, and energy consumption is critical if we're going to actually solve like a climate crisis that is going to impact the entire world. And how Bitcoin mining itself helps with that, and how the ethos behind Bitcoin and low time preference and the consumer culture helps with our environmental impact, and all of those things that that progressives in the US really care about or claim to care about. Like, Bitcoin has a hand in all of those different things. So the list is much longer than that, of course, too, right? Like, I wrote a whole book about it, but those are the big things to say, learn about the current financial system, zoom out to the global population, and unlearn some of the things that you think you know about energy use and energy production, because you're not going to actually help the world if you don't do those things.
I couldn't agree more. And yeah, if you're progressive, if you're liberal, if you typically vote blue, Bitcoin is for anyone, but Bitcoin is for you. Like, there's so many ways where you could find yourself really advocating and wanting to learn more and more about Bitcoin, which we couldn't agree with more. So get Jason's book. Everything you said too, we've done episodes on those topics. Scroll through our episode. I will say, I don't know if a lot of people know this, on our website, shout out to Evan, who's developed and manages our website. you can search these topics. So you can type in something and it'll pop up, whether it's in the title or the show notes. So if you want to type in Bitcoin environmentalism, you'll get several episodes that pop up in the search bar from our website. You can listen there, go listen in our podcast, things like that. So there's plenty of resources out there. Thank you, Jason, for the reminder of the low time preference, because sometimes a lot of things happen, a lot of things get busy, and I have to catch myself and probably many others in Bitcoin that are like, I have to respond. We have to do something about this. We have to let people know. Oh my gosh, like what do we do? And just low time preference, like everything's going to be okay. I'm a firm believer that Bitcoin is winning and doing great things year after year. Let's keep that wave going, and keep supporting that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Trey. It was a great talk. I appreciate the time.
Yeah, I'm glad you came on. And before I let you go, do you want to send people places? Where can they find you? I know since we've talked last as well, maybe it was out then, but I think you have audio version of your book as well, which is fantastic. So, let people know. It'll be in the show notes, but let people know here where they can find you.
I think if you want to follow me on Twitter or X, it's the C Jason Maier is my handle there. The website that houses my book and a lot of other resources is bitcoinprogressive.com. So those are the easiest ways to get in touch with me. Either DMs are open. There's a contact form on my website. So I get people who reach out to me that way too. Happy to engage with anybody if they want to learn more or just have questions. And that's the best way to get in touch with me. The book is called The Progressive's Case for Bitcoin. And hopefully people find it useful to orange pill somebody they love.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason, as always, for coming on and having a chat. And we'll be doing it again soon with a lot of other updates, I'm sure.
Yeah, great.